Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Carpe podcast. This episode features Dr. Kevin Vost. Dr. Vost is the author of more than a dozen books, including The Porch and The Cross, about the intersection of Stoicism and Christianity. Dr. Vost and I discuss how the Stoics' teachings have supplemented our Christian faith, Dr. Vost's journey from Catholicism to atheism and back, and the role St. Thomas Aquinas played in bringing him back to faith. We also discuss Dr. Vost's passion for weightlifting and how it can teach us about theology and philosophy. And Dr. Vost walks us through a memory technique that you can use to memorize things you never thought you could. This episode covers so many excellent topics. If you're a Christian, you don't want to miss it. And if you're not, you definitely don't want to miss it. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Kevin Vost. Alrighty, Dr. Kevin Vost, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, it's my pleasure, Liam. Thanks for having me on. I always enjoy the chance to talk about the Stoics.
Awesome. Well, I'm really excited for this conversation, especially getting to talk about the intersection of Stoicism and Christianity, because that's definitely one of my personal interests. So I would love it if you might be able to provide the audience a little bit about your background and especially kind of your journey from faith to away from faith and then back to it as well. That'd be awesome.
Sure. I'll try to make a 59-year-long story short in just a couple of minutes. But yeah, I was, raised as a Christian, as a Catholic. I went through Catholic grade school taught by fine Dominican sisters and Catholic high school taught by fine Viatorian priests and brothers, believed in Jesus Christ. I had many friends, Protestant friends who were at that time calling themselves, born again and saved, just serious Christians. So I had a good upbringing in my childhood and teenage years. In my late teens, one of my interests was also, two interests. One was bodybuilding or weightlifting, another was philosophy. They came together in the writings of this one man named Mike Mentzer, who was a very top-notch bodybuilder, Mr. Universe. He's expected to take over from Arnold Schwarzenegger at some point. But he was also into philosophy. So in these muscle magazines, he would write about philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche and Ayn Rand. And I started reading them myself. And basically, my faith was taken away. I came across arguments from atheists that made the idea of God seem superfluous or unnecessary or self-contradictory. And the way I was brought up, my own background and training, I didn't know how to answer those arguments. So I thought that, I wanted to follow what's true. So I thought I had no choice but to lose my faith, to disbelieve, because I didn't think there was a case for God. And I went along that way for about 25 years, from about the age 18 to 43. During that time, got married, got working in the disability field, obtained a doctorate in clinical psychology, did some psychology teaching on the side. And I also enjoyed during that time reading the philosophers, including the Stoics, including Aristotle was another one of my favorites. In my early 40s, a series of events led me to read the great Catholic philosopher and theologian, St. Thomas Aquinas, for the first time. And I was really wowed. I found that he knew the Stoics. He's citing Seneca, who wrote in Latin left and right. He really knew Aristotle. He wrote line-by-line commentaries on multiple of his books. In Aquinas' greatest work, the Summa Theologica, he cites Aristotle over 1,000 times. So it's really incredible knowledge there. But anyway, reading Thomas, I found that there were philosophical arguments that answered these arguments that the atheists had presented, that I thought were foolproof. But I realized Thomas had answered them over 700 years ago, borrowing from theologians and philosophers who lived long before he did. So thank God, in my early 40s, I was able again to find that belief in God was very, very reasonable. So, I was able to come back to Christ, come back to the church. So a wonderful event. That was, 16 years ago now. But also, as I come back to the church, I was able to do some writing. I write for various Catholic publishers. I'm working on the 21st and 22nd books right now. But I've also kept up my interest in the Stoics because they have so much wonderful information to share. And one of the beauties of the Stoics that I have found since I've come back and become immersed somewhat in the modern Stoic movement is that there is so much good there that people of different Christian denominations, people of different religions, people without even a religion at all, can find this common core of humanity, this appeal to reason and natural law that's just so wonderful there, within the Stoics, so they can be helpful to anyone. And for Christians, I believe they could even help us better live out our Christian lives.
That's an amazing testimony, and definitely interesting that echo of similarity between a lot of prominent Catholic thinkers right now who kind of drifted away, and then St. Thomas Aquinas brought him back. So that's really, really interesting to see that, and definitely another reason why every Christian, Catholic, Protestant, whatever, needs to read St. Thomas Aquinas. So first of all, obviously the Bible references Stoic philosophers in Acts 17, and it seems like the Apostle Paul kind of has a conflict with some Stoic philosophers there. So from your perspective, how does the modern Stoic movement in the church and people of Christian faith, how can they reconcile their beliefs, or how can they see them as kind of complementary? And where do you think they kind of need to part company and Christians need to be a little bit more particular?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question there. And yeah, St. Paul mentions them. There's quite an interesting body of writing now about reciprocal influences possibly between Paul and some of the Stoics who were his contemporaries. Seneca and Musonius Rufus lived around the same time St. Paul did. But okay, and I see this in the modern Stoic movement. The Stoics, they're mainly known for their writings on ethics or virtuous life, and also for their powerful lessons that are useful to psychology, how to keep yourself free from anger, from anxiety, from depression, how to live a calm, serene life, how to focus on a life of virtue. And that's of real value to anyone, regardless of your religion. It's valuable to Christians if it helps us, live out Christ's call to love God with all that we are and our neighbor as ourselves better. So the central lessons there of ethics, I think, are of high value. Now, they also looked at the other branches of philosophy, metaphysics, or like the nature of the universe and the nature of reality, and logic, other issues like that. And as I see in the modern Stoic movement, most people don't necessarily feel it's necessary to agree with some of their metaphysical ideas to be able to employ the really valid and useful ethical ideas. For example, if you look at different Stoics, and different people will interpret this differently. They're kind of all over the place in terms of what they think about God, whether there is a God, or is it a kind of a pantheistic idea that God is throughout the universe, or that God is the universe, or that God is just another word for nature or fate. There's different perspectives there. Some, especially Epictetus, do speak of God in a manner that will sound very familiar to Christians, because he talks in a very personal sense, speaking of God as Father, talking about our job is to follow God's will and to sing him praises day and night. So, the Stoics had some very interesting and differing ideas about God, but none of them were Christians. They did not know Jesus Christ. They had not accepted Jesus Christ. So as Christians, we can never get the fullness of the truth from the Stoics, but we can get wonderful partial truths about human living there. So as far as a few specifics, for most of the Stoic lessons on virtue, on controlling your passions and emotions, I think they're wonderful and fully consistent with Christian thought. Just a few things to watch out for is the Stoics typically did endorse the idea that suicide can be appropriate at times, which in a way is a bit of a paradox, because they're showing us how nothing should be able to conquer us. It's just all our mindset and the way we react to events. And yet they did write about certain times where we can, like the door is open for us. We can leave if things are too harsh. So I wouldn't endorse that idea, though the Stoics were not people who went around saying, hey, you should commit suicide. They were just people that in some of the writings thought that could, at certain circumstances, be a valid option. And I don't agree with that. Also, some from a Christian perspective would say, watch out for the Stoics, because there is a sense, because they didn't know Christ, of what we might call a Pelagianism. The idea that you can draw yourself to heaven by your own bootstraps, that we don't need God, that just through the natural virtues we can perfect ourselves. So we wouldn't want to go there. But even in that regard, I do say that several of the Stoics, do talk about a God and that everything comes from God. Some are ambiguous. Probably in some ways the most ambiguous might be Marcus Aurelius. At times he speaks about God. In one or two of his, or more of his meditations, he says, that there are ancient thinkers who thought that there's a divine providence guiding everything. And some thought that it's kind of like many modern thinkers, it's just atoms, we're just a material universe with the atoms are bouncing about and creating everything. And Aurelius said that really though, whichever of these is true, we should still live ethical, moral lives. So I think that's why there's a great appeal to the Stoics, both among Christians and non-Christians.
Absolutely. So definitely one of the things you talk a lot about in your book is that element of Epictetus's metaphysics that seem like they're very close to matching up with Christian metaphysics. And so with that, which of the Stoic philosophers is it Epictetus because of that sort of metaphysical element, or which of the Stoic philosophers really resonates with you personally the most, and kind of what's the thinking behind that?
That really is a good question, Liam. And I'll just preface this. I've been involved in some other projects, some Christian writing, so I haven't read the Stoics in several weeks now. And preparing for this, I go back and I'm rereading it. Like, oh wow, I'm always awed, by the wonder there. And I read about Musonius Rufus, like, oh yeah, he's the man. Then I move on to Epictetus. Same with Seneca and Aurelius. So to me, it's really hard to differentiate. I really find value in all the four main Stoics that wrote about ethics. Musonius Rufus, who was Epictetus' teacher, Epictetus himself, Seneca, and then the great emperor Marcus Aurelius. So which one resonates with me the most? It's kind of hard to say. Probably the two that I read the most. I like Epictetus. He is very gruff. He's very straightforward. He's humorous, in laying out these lessons. And also Seneca, I really like him. He's very eloquent. He really has a way with words. So, and of course, Aurelius and Musonius have their own benefits there. From a Christian perspective, Musonius Rufus lays out teachings on the nature of family, the family and sexuality that are amazingly consistent with Christian teaching. So there's a really close affinity there in Epictetus' teacher, Musonius Rufus. But I'm hedging, but here's what I was just thinking about before we get on. Which of these four is my favorite? Well, to me, it's kind of like I like classical music. So it's kind of like, well, who do I like better? Bach or Haydn or Mozart or Beethoven? I also like a more modern guy named Anton Bruckner, But like, while I'm immersed in their world, I love their world. The others are similar, but unique. So for that reason, I find it hard-pressed to pick a favorite. If I could read only one, it might be Seneca, because we have so much more of his material than we do of the other Stoics.
Yeah, absolutely. Seneca was very prolific, but I do love that when you're in there, you're in their world. And so you kind of get totally immersed in that perspective. So that was one of the things I found really interesting also about your book was Musonius Rufus's writings on family and marriage and things like that. And so being married yourself and having a family, how do you approach your family and marriage from the perspective of someone who's read the Stoics and tries to incorporate those principles into your life? Obviously, the Stoics advocate for being virtuous, but also kind of a level of detachment. And obviously, that's something that it's hard to maintain in a marriage or relationships with family. How do you incorporate that in, or how do you think about those Stoic teachings on detachment when you're also thinking about those really close relationships within your family?
Yeah, now that is a real good question. And I will say the Stoics are very helpful for family life. Though myself, being an imperfect human being, I don't always. I wish I followed them better than I could. But here's certain ways like detachment. Epictetus has some famous sayings that are in his old handbook. I believe they're also in the discourses about like the way you look at your wife and children. And he's saying, that realize that they are mortals and they're not going to live together forever. So if they would die, you should not be totally devastated. You should keep that in mind every day, that your loved ones are mortal human beings. And the same with you in relation to them. So some could say that, that might make us, think less of, I don't want to grow too close because then I'll be hurt too bad if we die. And I don't look at it that way. I look at it from the perspective that is true. I never know when my wife is going to be gone, or if I will be gone for her, or if I'm going to outlive my children, hopefully, or not. So that can be a wonderful motivation for us to really show them love and care and attention while we're there with them. So I don't view it as like an isolation or detachment. I'm not going to get close because I might get hurt. It's thinking that, I might lose them. So I really got to cherish them while I have them. So So from so many of these ideas, I really get a lot of good out of the Stoics. I think even what can be seen as detachment, they're often can serve as a goad to a deeper love, a deeper attachment to our loved ones.
That's definitely one of the passages of Stoicism that I struggle with is that detachment and viewing loved ones in that way. So I definitely appreciate your perspective on that.
Mm-hmm.
So another thing that I really was interested, especially as a Christian and a Stoic, was your perspective on Stoicism as it relates to kind of the modern American gospel, because a lot of the prosperity preaching and stuff like that has brought in the idea that if we're faithful Christians, we'll be blessed. God won't allow us to suffer. God will bring all the things we want into our lives and make sure that it's not full of things we don't. And really make sure that this life is very opulent for us. Obviously, I think the Stoics would tend to look at things a little bit differently. So, what lessons do you think that especially modern American Christians can derive from that perspective of the Stoics, who, on the one hand, would say, you don't need to look to these externals for validation versus kind of the prosperity preachers? And how would you say that we can kind of bring more of that into modern American Christianity?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one thing, that's another issue too, where the Stoics differ. From a Christian perspective, did they believe there was everlasting life? A life after death, and some did and some didn't. I mean, he said they weren't sure. But even from the perspective of those who might think there's no life beyond this one, they still argued that, we are not going to be fulfilled and happy and full humans if we're so focused on these externals, pleasures, honor, status, things. There's some interesting lines in the early lectures that we have of Musonius Rufus, where he talks about people mistakenly thinking pleasure is the highest good. And he cites some old example of a Spartan boy who asked an elder person, he said, well, is it really toil and hardship and pain? Aren't those really the greatest goods? And he cites some line from Homer that says, boy, you are, basically, you have a wonderful idea there. That's a wonderful, noble sentiment. So the idea of the Stoics was that not necessarily we're going to go seeking out intense suffering, but that whatever hardship comes our way, that's a chance to build our characters, to endure, to make something positive come from it. So the Stoic message is very much diametrically opposed to what some call the gospel of prosperity message. There was one Stoic who actually was prosperous, and that was Seneca, a very, very rich man. But it's a very, very complicated story. He was an advisor to the Emperor Nero when he was young, and then Nero turned on him years later. The story is that Seneca tried to divest himself of much of his wealth later in life and just live the philosophical life, but Nero didn't let him do that. But you read through him, and then through Musonius Rufus, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, who of course was also very wealthy because he was an emperor. But you can see even in his writings, external things, even honor and status, were not what he was after. What they're after is living a good, virtuous life, striving to serve God, follow God's will, to do the right things by your neighbor, and not to desire things that are outside of your control, which would be all the kinds of the externals, things and titles and honors and so forth. So the message of the Stoics is in line with much in the history of Christianity, but I would say not with this idea that if God loves you, you're not going to suffer and you're going to be wealthy and famous and so forth.
I love that perspective on it, because I do think we've sort of robbed the gospel of some of its richness by making it all about getting a new Corvette in this life and not about the great joys of heaven we're going to experience in the next. And as much as I love talking about the Stoics, you also have a perspective on Thomas Aquinas that I don't get to hear too often from a lot of my guests. So I'm really interested, especially in your journey back to faith. What were the arguments or the reasons that you really resonated with from Thomas Aquinas? Where was it, the 5 ways, or what kind of things really convinced you that these were all satisfactory answers and that Christianity was the more reasonable worldview than your previous atheism.
Yeah, and I'll just preface this with some background. My training at the doctor level was as a psychologist. And when I got reading Thomas Aquinas, I read much what was in the middle, the second part of the Summa Theologica, which is all about human beings, what it is, how we think, how we feel, our passions, the virtues, what satisfies us, what fulfills us. And I read all that and I thought, wow, Thomas has got this down. I considered him a more profound psychologist than any of the famous psychologists or psychiatrists or modern psychoanalysts that I had read. So I knew there's he hadn't really a credence there. He knew what he's talking about in terms of human nature. Now, but the crux of the matter that brought me back to Christ was from his first part of the Summa Theologica, where he talks about God. He is famous for his 5 ways, 5 little brief proofs that are shown in the early part of his Summa Theologica, and elaborated more in some of his other writings, like the Summa Contra Gentiles. But I'll tell you 2 that really hit with me, because they addressed probably the two main arguments of the atheists that drew me away from the church. Here's the argument number 1. And you'll see this in modern books. Richard Dawkins, the God delusion, uses this one. This idea of God is self-contradictory. So how could God be both all-powerful and all-knowing? Because if God knows what he's going to do tomorrow, then he doesn't have any power to change it. So it's like setting up a contradiction. But yeah, that's a hard one to answer. Now, in Thomas's writing in the Summa Theologica, not in the part where he's giving the 5 proofs about God, but in a little bit later part where he talks about God's attributes. What God would have to be like and not be like if he exists here, as the creator of the universe, as the source of all being. And one thing part in that, he talks about God's eternity. All right. He says, we live in temporal time. We have a yesterday, today, and tomorrow. We're never fully actualized all at once. We always have new potentials we're trying to fulfill. But God is in the eternal now. God is completely actualized at all times and every time. So he doesn't have a yesterday, today, and tomorrow like you and I. Everything is present for him at once. So that false dilemma about God's tomorrow, it really doesn't make sense from the perspective of God. It does from the perspective of a human being, but not for what we're talking about. God. And Thomas gives a very simple, homely example. Just, imagine that you're walking to some small village and it's a hilly route. So, you may not see that village until you reach the top of the last hill, and you're not going to know who came before you and who's after you. He said, but imagine the perspective of a person who's high above. They can see the whole journey the whole time. They can see the whole village, and they can see everyone on the trail. He said, that's like how it is for God. Our perspective is very limited, a little piece at a time, and God's there. It must be eternally present. He knows everything at all times. So that really got me thinking. I thought that was a very intriguing answer to this dilemma. And the other one, this is an idea that is popular among the objectivists, the atheist philosophers who follow Ayn Rand, a person who influenced me a lot in my youth. And I think she has a lot of good ideas on the secular level, but not when it comes to God. And their basic idea is that the idea of God is like superfluous. We don't need it. Open your eyes. What do you see out there? You see the universe, right? So that's the starting point. Existence. Existence exists. They said it doesn't make sense to ask where that comes from. It just plain is, And that kind of satisfied me for 25 years until I read more of St. Thomas. And here it is, especially in one of the proofs, the 3rd proof, where he talks about the difference between contingent being and necessary being. And contingent being would be everything that we can see with our eyes. Look out there, whatever you see with your eyes right now, much of this didn't exist, 100 years ago. I know, I didn't. Almost nobody on earth did. And if you go back far enough, the earth itself didn't exist. So nothing in the universe is by necessity is always been there and always will be there. But for there to have been possibly nothing at some time, and now that there is this universe, there must be a being whose existence is not contingent, maybe not, a being who simply must exist and is therefore the font of all other existent creatures. And one way he talks about this is the difference between existence and essence. And existence is that something is, and essence is what specifically is it, what it is. And he said, for God, they are one. His essence, what he is his existence. It is necessary that he exists. The only being that it's all in one. He must exist. So he's the fount of all existence. I thought pretty profound and intriguing. And one thing that kind of intrigued me too, Thomas, goes through logical arguments. He borrows a lot from Aristotle and others to come up with these proofs of the existence of God. But on this one too, it's almost like, oh, by the way, if you look in the book of Exodus 3:16, when Moses asked God in the burning bush, what is your name? And he says, I am who am, or basically, I am. He says, Moses, well, who should I say sent me? He says, basically tell him, I am sent you. So that I am, those two little words from these ancient Hebrews out in the desert, sum up this idea of this fundamental being that God is, whose essence and existence are one. So just amazing, mind-boggling things. And that's just a tip of the iceberg. But Thomas, as I read through his first part of the Summa, he's answering virtually every argument for modern atheists I found answered in him so long ago in such a beautiful way.
Yeah, it kind of gives me chills to hear those again, because definitely when I've struggled with my faith, I've found those arguments always help re-ground me. So really I love getting to talk about this stuff. So another thing that you are kind of well known for is your combining a lot of your virtue and Catholic writings with the fact you're a very physically fit individual. So how have the Stoics and Scripture kind of shaped your thinking toward physical fitness and health, and how have they kind of helped you progress in that? Or obviously you said you've been interested in this for a long time. What's your journey with that been like?
Oh yeah, I've been involved in weightlifting since about the second grade. As a real young child, I was totally inspired by the Superman character on TV. I wanted to be Superman. And when I was old enough to realize I couldn't be, I saw a weightlifter on television and thought, now that's what I want to be. So yeah, I've always been involved in strength training, and in my later years in cardiovascular type exercise too. I just love it. I love the feel of it, how it makes me feel more energetic and makes me feel mentally sharper and more fulfilled. So I've always enjoyed that. So as the years went by, whenever I read the Stoics, when they talked about physical issues as metaphors for the mental development or just in and of themselves, I always, perked my ears up. So after my first Catholic book, it was a book called Memorize the Faith, where my background in psychology, my specialty area was memory and memory improvement. And it ended up that Thomas Aquinas even wrote about that. So I wrote this book that highlighted how to improve your memory for memorizing things like the Ten Commandments, the books of the Bible, and all that, using methods that were actually recommended by Thomas Aquinas and his teacher, St. Albert the Great, that came from previous Greeks and Romans and so on. So anyway, after that book came out, my editor realized that I'd also done some writing, sports psychology writing for some muscle magazines in the past. And I was actually thinking about writing a book about with the ancient Roman idea of healthy mind and a healthy body. How can maintaining our physique helps us function better cognitively and so on. But while I was pondering that idea, thinking I'm going to rely heavily on the Stoics, my editor said, hey, would you like to do a book on a Christian perspective on physical fitness and taking care of your body? So I just ate that up, So I did put out a book in 2008 called Fit for Eternal Life, where I incorporated, the Christian approach or understanding that our bodies are good. God made us with bodies. We're going to have glorified bodies, in eternity someday. And our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit. We're supposed to take care of them, So that was a guiding theme there. I peppered the different chapters where I talked about strength training, endurance training, the proper nutrition, with sayings from the Stoics as well. So it's a lot of fun putting it together. And just in brief, Thomas influenced that book because I think, well, how am I going to structure all this? And I love the way Thomas talked about the virtues. So, okay, the virtue of fortitude comes from the Latin word for strength. It's also called courage, or valor, bravery, and so forth. But I thought, well, what a wonderful virtue to use to describe strength training. Thomas says fortitude is overcoming difficult obstacles to the good. Well, few obstacles more difficult than super heavy barbells. So I thought that's a nice virtue to keep in mind for our strength training. We're training ourselves to do increasingly difficult things. Thomas also says the principal act of fortitude is to endure, and we speak of cardiovascular or endurance as endurance training. So that's a great virtue to keep in mind if we're going to run or ride a bike or walk or swim, or use the the cardio machine. So we're going to work that in and build on that virtue. Well, what about our diet, our nutrition? There's a virtue of temperance or self-control that counters the vice and sin of gluttony, and helps us maintain our bodies in the proper way. So temperance was our guiding virtue for diet. Well, what about the third cardinal virtue is justice. That's giving each person their rightful due. Well, how am I going to tie this in? Okay, I'll have special chapters for what about the special needs of the elderly? What about the special needs of women? What about the special needs of young kids, children, and teens? So that's how we kind of try to give them their due by focusing on how this taking proper care of your body applies to these different age ranges and the different sexes. And then the fourth cardinal virtue is prudence or practical wisdom. Well, how I tried to tie that in was, okay, that's like putting the whole package together. How do we, maybe busy people with full lives, how do we put together a regimen of diet and exercise that we can do as Christians within our life without taking us away from duties that might even be more important, So how can we fit a proper regimen into our lifestyle? So part of the focus of my fitness book was looking for that like minimal dose. How little time can we devote in the course of a week to take proper care of ourselves and leave time for others? So that was also a major focus there. And I will say that when I wrote that book, and during those decades, my 30s and 40s, when I was very, very busy, I would strength train as little as one time per week. And I would try to do 3 brief cardio sessions a week, walking or running or something. Now I've been retired for a few years. So I have the luxury of doing some form of weight training 6 days a week and a cardio on the 7th and additional light cardio all the way through. So the idea is that your exercise needs and requirements and what you want to do might change greatly over time. But if you're a busy person, the good news is it doesn't take a lot to take proper care of your body. I should say, too, the final virtue I really used to try to tie it all together was the highest of the virtues, a charity, the love of God and neighbor. So we should take care of our bodies, not so people say, oh, look at how big and strong he is, or oh, look at how beautiful she is, but so we can, become what I call dynamos for charity. So we have the energy to do the things we need to do, for our family members around the house, around the yard, and also so we can maybe inspire our own families to take proper care of themselves, because they're just going to feel a lot better and function a lot better if they've had, taken at least that minimal dose of exercise and proper nutrition to properly take care of their bodies.
That's awesome. I love the idea of inspiring others and, staying healthy ourselves so we can be our best for other people to serve most effectively. That's I love how you articulate that. So I'm also very interested, and I remember, when I first got introduced to the concept of a memory palace and things like that, that really kind of blew my mind. And so that's one of your specialties. So I'm really interested, especially in how can people immediately start practicing something like those memory techniques that you specialize in, and start testing themselves on how they're improving. Like, what are some very actionable things they can start doing today to start working on their memory?
Sure, and it's amazingly simple. And I discovered these techniques in my teens, and I was wowed by how much they helped me. So they made it a breeze when I went through college and graduate school to memorize things, for tests. It made it amazingly easy. In my book, Memorize the Faith, I use a location method. It's just based on like a normal house. It's kind of loosely patterned after my own house. We use this system of structuring what you're trying to remember in its exact order by numbered locations. For example, the first thing I do is the 10 Commandments. So the location number 1 is just, you imagine you're walking up to my front door, and the door opens and there's a blinding light. You hear this resounding crash. You imagine this dramatic scene. And why do I do that? Well, the first location stands for the first commandment. And that blinding light represents God. God, it was God who said, let there be light, and God's often represented by light. And that crash we're saying is the falling of the false idols, not to worship false gods. And then just one more example. We move in. The doormat, I say, is location number 2. And you imagine that this mat is cursing at you. It has a mouth and it's saying foul language, These memory techniques work best when the images are bizarre, out of the ordinary, so they'll sink into your memory. And that's just a reminder to not use the Lord's name in vain. Well, maybe one more. I have you imagine that you're looking at this glass panel next to my front door, and you're looking back at my front yard, and you realize, wow, that's the most beautiful, glorious day I've ever seen out there. I didn't realize that when I came in. So basically, number 1, if you remember that great light in the crash. Oh, there's we need to love God, with all we are, and not worship false idols. 2, that cursing doormat. Yeah, we're not supposed to use the Lord's name in vain. Number 3, that glorious day, we'll keep holy the Lord's day, So we go that way through like all the 10 commandments just inside this little foyer. Then we memorize other things, the 7 deadly sins, the 7 virtues, the Beatitudes, the mysteries of the Rosary, the sacraments, going through other parts of a house and linking these images to specific places. So, in general, how could a person do this in their daily life? Well, a gal I used to work with had a kid like in 3rd grade or so, and she knew I did this memory stuff, and they had this new vocabulary test coming up. And her son had a heck of a time learning the vocabulary word. So she asked me about this. So I said, just go into your own house, and with your child, pick out these various locations in your house. Like, okay, yeah, our front door is going to be number 1. And maybe they have some potted plant or something next to it. Well, that'll be number 2, So you go around your own house, set up these locations, but also place those vocabulary words, an image that would represent them in each of those locations, and practice this and have fun with it and see how well you do. And it's amazing. She told me that her son the next day, or a few days later, had the highest score on the vocabulary test because this worked so well for him. So basically, Thomas said there's 4 elements to this technique. 2 you already know. To memorize something, you have to pay close attention to. You have to concentrate. 2, you have to repeat or rehearse, even if you use these methods. But the 2 extra elements are developing a system, an ordering system. And I prefer the method where you, like a palace or a memory house, where you go through simple parts of a house. And it works even best if it's your own house, because what do you know better than your own house, And that 4th element is setting up these images, a striking image, a striking scene, a striking event that will remind you of what you're trying to remember. So basically, that's the gist of it. And I will just say, this technique is so useful that whenever I do a live talk, I use no notes. I set up one of these memory houses. And I just love talking that way. And it's just amazingly useful. I think almost everyone can profit from this kind of a method.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Vost, for talking today about the Stoics and about memory. Where can people find out more about you if they want to learn more?
Well, my own website's drvost.com, just drvost.com, and there's a comment box on the bottom if anyone would like to contact me.
Well, thank you so much, and it was a pleasure talking to you today, and hope to chat again soon.
Well, me too. Thank you so much, Liam.
Thank you. Hey everybody, thank you so much for stopping by today. If you enjoyed what you heard, please stop by Spotify or iTunes, wherever you get your podcasts from. Give us a 5-star review. I would love to hear more about what you enjoy, so connect with me on Twitter @LiamD'Aubry. Thank you all so much, and remember, seize the day.